Elira Vance lived in Valmere, a city where silence separated the forgotten from the celebrated, where marble estates towered above narrow streets, and destiny seemed assigned at birth rather than earned. She worked in the Royal Conservatory's textile archives, restoring ancient fabrics that carried the scent of history and the weight of forgotten names. Her life was quiet, repetitive, and carefully contained within shelves of brittle parchment and faded silk. That evening rain pressed softly against the tall glass windows of the archive hall, while she carefully traced delicate golden threads across a centuries-old embroidery believed to have belonged to a royal consort, long erased from public memory. The lamplight flickered over her focused face, as if the past itself was watching her work. An older archivist named Mara Quell approached between the shelves, her footsteps slow and deliberate, observing Elira with a mix of concern and familiarity. Mara remarked that most young women were preparing for the royal ball that very night, a grand gathering at Aurelian Hall where power dressed itself in jewels and influence spoke louder than bloodline. Elira did not look up as she replied that she was not missing anything, her voice steady but distant. Mara gently countered that people often claimed indifference only when they had stopped believing anything could change. Elira continued her restoration work, yet something in her mind drifted to a younger version of herself, who once sketched gowns in the margins of old manuscripts and believed that effort could reshape destiny. She remembered how those dreams had gradually faded beneath the weight of realism, replaced by the quiet acceptance that some doors were never meant to open for people like her. Suddenly a sharp knock echoed through the archive entrance, breaking the stillness. A courier entered, soaked from the rain, holding a sealed ivory envelope marked with a crest she did not recognize, a symbol of intertwined lions and laurel branches that suggested authority far beyond her world. He asked for Elira Vance, and Mara immediately reacted with disbelief, questioning how such a message could possibly reach someone from the archives. Elira stepped forward, accepting the envelope with cautious hands, as the courier confirmed it came through the royal registry and carried official sanction. When he left, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Mara leaned closer, asking if Elira had any connection to the upper court, but Elira shook her head in confusion, insisting she knew no one of such standing. Yet as she stared at the seal, a memory surfaced of a strange manuscript she had once restored, filled with references to hidden attendees at royal events and fate-bound invitations that defied social rank. At the time, she dismissed it as symbolic writing, but now the coincidence felt unsettling. She opened the envelope and found an invitation to the royal ball at Aurelian Hall, addressed directly to her name in elegant gold script. Mara was stunned, insisting such an invitation was nearly impossible for someone without lineage or patronage. Elira reread the card repeatedly, searching for a hidden error or misprint, but none appeared. The idea of attending a gathering reserved for the elite felt unreal, like stepping into a story written for someone else. She admitted softly that people like her did not belong in such places, but Mara responded with a measured calm, suggesting that sometimes life did not ask permission before changing direction. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed in a pale evening glow. Church bells echoed faintly across Valmere, marking the passage of time as though signaling a turning point. Elira placed the invitation on the wooden table and studied it in silence, noticing her reflection in the window glass behind it, ordinary and unremarkable compared to the world it represented. For the first time, she did not immediately return to her work. Instead, she lingered, caught between disbelief and something she could not fully name. The possibility of stepping into the royal ball now existed in a way she could not ignore, even if it unsettled everything she believed about her place in the world. And somewhere deep inside that uncertainty, something long buried stirred quietly, not yet hope, but the dangerous shape of it beginning to form. Yet the question remained, why would the royal court summon someone who did not exist in their world? And what would await her inside those golden halls if she dared to go? Illyra Vance stood before the mirror-like glass of her small chamber in Valmere, the royal invitation resting on the wooden table behind her, like a silent command that refused to be ignored. The archive hall still lingered in her mind, the scent of old parchment and rain-soaked stone clinging to her thoughts as she replayed the moment the courier arrived. It felt unreal that something so delicate, so improbable, could have found its way into her life. Mara Quell had insisted she rest before making any decisions, but sleep was impossible. Because Alliance, she finally dressed in her simplest clean gown, not for the ball, but to walk outside and think, hoping the cold air of Valmere might dissolve the confusion tightening in her chest. The city had changed its facion. Illyra walked slowly, keeping to the quieter edges of the street, where the sound of celebration was muted, but still present, like a reminder of another world. As she passed a reflecting fountain, she paused, noticing how ordinary she looked, compared to the shimmering silhouettes she glimpsed in the distance. For a moment, she wondered if the invitation had been delivered to the wrong person, if somewhere in the upper districts, another Illyra existed who belonged in silk halls and golden masks. But the seal had been precise, unmistakable, deliberate. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps behind her, measured and unhurried, not the hurried pace of a passerby, but something intentional. She turned slightly, but saw only shadows between lantern light. The feeling of being observed settled over her, subtle yet undeniable. And for the first time since receiving the invitation, she felt something beneath her uncertainty. Unease. She quickened her pace, crossing into a narrower street lined with iron balconies and closed shutters, the air growing colder as though the city itself was shifting around her presence. Then she saw it. A black carriage without insignia, waiting at the end of the lane, its horses still, its driver motionless. The door was already open. Yet something deeper, something unfamiliar, held her in place. A voice came from inside the carriage, calm and composed, neither harsh nor inviting, simply certain. It asked her name. The silence between them stretched until it felt as though the entire street had paused to listen. Then the voice spoke again, saying it had been expected that she would hesitate. That statement alone sent a ripple of confusion through her thoughts, because no one should have been expecting her anywhere. The carriage step creaked slightly as someone shifted inside, though the figure remained unseen.
Just when Illyra Vance thought the royal ball was already overwhelming, nothing could have prepared her for the way the entire hall reacted the moment the Duke looked at her. It was not admiration, not curiosity, but something far more unsettling, recognition. In a place where she was supposed to be invisible, she suddenly became the center of attention without a single introduction. And the strangest part? She had never met the Duke before in her life. So why did he look at her like he had been waiting for her all along? Why did the music itself seem to pause for her presence? Illyra is now standing at the edge of a truth she does not understand, surrounded by people who clearly know something she doesn't. And what the Duke is about to do next will completely change the direction of her fate inside the royal ball.
Illyra took one cautious step backward, her heart tightening as the weight of the invitation suddenly felt less like opportunity and more like a summons she did not understand. The voice continued, softer now, mentioning that the royal ball was not merely a celebration but a threshold, and that thresholds always revealed those who were already marked by something beyond status or title. The words unsettled her in a way she could not explain, as though they were meant specifically for her, without ever calling her name. Behind her, the distant music from Aurelian Hall swelled faintly across the wind, reminding her how close, yet distant, that world truly was. She felt caught between two forces, one pulling her toward the carriage, the other anchoring her to the life she knew. Then the unseen figure inside finally said something that froze her entirely, revealing that her invitation had not been an accident, and that refusing it would not restore the life she believed she had. Illyra's breath caught, as she realized this was no ordinary summons, and whatever awaited her at the royal ball had already begun long before she arrived. And just as she made a decision to speak, the carriage door moved slightly wider on its own, as if inviting her into a destiny she did not choose, but might never escape. Vance stood frozen at the edge of the narrow Valmere street, the black carriage waiting like a silent judgment at the end of the lane, its open door unmoving, yet inviting, in a way that felt unnatural, almost aware of her hesitation. The unseen voice from inside had already unsettled her, but now the air itself seemed heavier, as though the city was holding its breath around her decision. She took a cautious step forward, then stopped again, her instincts warning her that crossing that distance would change something she could not undo. The voice spoke once more, calm and precise, acknowledging her hesitation as though it had already been predicted long before she arrived. It said her name again, not as a question, but as confirmation, and added that the invitation she held was never meant to be optional in the way she believed. Elira's grip tightened at her sides, confusion and fear intertwining as she asked who was inside the carriage, but her voice came out quieter than she intended. There was a brief silence before the answer came, not a name, but a statement that she had already been observed long before the invitation reached her hands. The words made her pulse tighten, because nothing in her life had ever suggested she was worth watching. Behind her, the distant music from Aurelian Hall swelled faintly through the night air, a reminder of the world she was supposedly being drawn into. Yet the carriage before her felt like a different kind of world entirely. The unseen figure then asked her a question that shifted everything, asking whether she had ever wondered why certain people are given invitations without explanation while others are never considered at all. And before she could respond, it stated that the royal ball was not a celebration but a selection. Elira stepped back immediately, the word selection echoing in her mind with discomfort, because it implied judgment, purpose, and exclusion beyond social class. Then, from inside the carriage, the voice finally revealed something that made her breath catch. It said her name was not unknown in certain records of the royal court, even if she herself had never seen them, and that someone had ensured she would receive that invitation at this exact moment in time. Elira's mind raced, trying to connect impossibilities into logic, but nothing made sense. She asked again who was speaking, her voice now steadier but sharper, demanding clarity. Yet the response was only that names held little meaning where she was going. The lantern light flickered across the cobblestone as the wind shifted, and for a brief second, she thought she saw movement inside the carriage, like a silhouette turning toward her. The voice softened slightly, almost deliberately, and told her that refusing the invitation would not return her to the life she believed was stable, because her name had already been written into events unfolding beyond her awareness. That statement struck deeper than fear, because it suggested inevitability rather than choice. Elira's thoughts spiraled as she realized this was not an ordinary summons, not a mistake, not even a curiosity, but something structured and intentional that had been waiting for her response. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything she had experienced, as though the night itself was pressing her toward a decision. Then, without warning, the carriage step shifted again, and the unseen figure inside said only one final line before falling silent, telling her that the royal ball would begin whether she arrived willingly or not, and that the first dance had already been decided long before the music started. Elira stood trembling as the meaning of those words settled over her like a shadow she could not shake, and just as she lifted her eyes toward the open door, the lantern inside the carriage flickered out completely, leaving her in darkness with a choice she did not fully understand. If you are still following this story, subscribe to Sandy Love Tales, drop your thoughts in the comments, and stay close. Because what Elira discovers at the royal ball will reveal who truly owns her destiny. Elira Vance stood inside the black carriage as the door closed behind her, with a soft but final sound, sealing her away from the narrow Valmere street and the life she had always known. The interior was dim, lit only by a faint suspended lantern that swayed gently, despite the carriage being still, casting shifting shadows across polished wood and velvet seating. She did not sit immediately, her body tense as she tried to understand how quickly everything had changed from a quiet evening in the archives to this enclosed space carrying her towards something unknown. Across from her, the unseen presence remained silent for a moment, as if allowing her fear to settle before speaking again. Then the same calm voice returned, closer now, explaining that hesitation was expected but unnecessary, because the path ahead had already been set in motion long before she received the invitation. Illyra demanded answers, her voice sharper now, asking who had arranged this and why she was being treated like a piece in a plan she never agreed to. The response was not direct, only that Valmer's highest order rarely acted without observing patterns first, and she was one of those patterns. That statement unsettled her more than anything else, because it reduced her existence to something studied rather than lived. The carriage began to move without warning, wheels rolling smoothly over stone, causing her to steady herself against the seat as the city outside blurred into motion. Through the small window, she watched Valmer transform from narrow lantern-lit streets into broader avenues lined with towering architecture that glowed faintly under moonlight. The voice continued, explaining that the royal ball was not merely an event, but a convergence point where hidden truths were quietly revealed through selection, observation, and recognition. Illyra felt a tightening in her chest as she listened, unable to decide whether she was being guided toward opportunity or something far more dangerous disguised as elegance. She pressed for clarity again, asking what exactly she had been selected for, but the answer remained vague, suggesting only that some individuals are noticed not for who they are in society, but for what they might disrupt. The carriage slowed as they approached the outskirts of Aurelian Hall, where the glow of thousands of lanterns illuminated the massive structure like a second sun resting upon the earth. Music drifted through the air, distant but powerful, carrying with it the rhythm of an event already in motion. Illyra leaned toward the window and saw guests arriving in elaborate gowns and formal coats, their laughter and conversation blending into a world that felt completely detached from her own. For a moment, she considered turning back, but the carriage door would not open from her side, as if the decision had already been removed from her control. The unseen figure finally spoke again, telling her that once she stepped out, she would not be a guest in the ordinary sense, but something closer to a question the court had been waiting to ask for a long time. The door opened on its own, revealing a world of light, music, and eyes that would soon turn toward her without understanding why she had been brought there. Illyra hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding as she realized there was no longer a version of this night where she simply returned home unchanged. And as she took her first step onto the marble path leading into the royal ball, the voice behind her whispered one final warning, that the first person to truly recognize her would not be a friend, but the one who ensured she was invited in the first place. If you are following this story, don't forget to subscribe to Sandy Love Tales, share your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned, because what happens inside the royal ball will decide whether Illyra becomes a guest or something far more important than anyone in that hall is prepared for. The moment Illyra Vance stepped fully into Aurelian Hall, the world around her dissolved into light, music, and motion so refined it felt almost unreal, as though the air itself had been trained to obey elegance. Chandeliers hung like suspended constellations above a sea of masked nobles, whose laughter and whispers blended into a single living rhythm. Every surface gleamed, every movement seemed rehearsed, and every glance carried meaning she could not yet interpret. Illyra stood near the entrance for a brief moment, unnoticed at first, as servants and guests flowed past her, like she was part of the architecture rather than a person. Then, slowly, the shift began. Conversations softened, heads turned. The unfamiliar presence she carried, quiet but undeniable, started to pull attention toward her like gravity. She became aware of it instantly, the subtle change in energy that followed recognition without explanation. A servant approached, offering to guide her, but even he seemed uncertain about where she belonged. Before she could respond, a distant orchestral pause created a momentary silence across the hall. and in that silence, a single voice echoed from the upper platform, announcing the arrival of the Duke of Aurelian Court. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path that led down a grand staircase where a man appeared, composed and unmistakably powerful, dressed not in excessive ornament, but in controlled authority. Illyra did not move, yet somehow, in that sweeping glance, his attention locked directly onto her. It was not curiosity, it was recognition. The music resumed, but softer now, as if the hall itself was waiting. Guests followed the Duke's gaze, and confusion rippled through the crowd when they realized where it had landed. Illyra felt her breath tighten as he began walking toward her with deliberate calm, ignoring the murmurs rising behind him. Every step he took erased distance, certainty, and her ability to pretend she did not belong in this moment. When he finally stopped before her, the hall seemed to disappear behind his presence, leaving only silence between them. He studied her face for a long moment, then spoke in a voice low enough that only she could hear, saying he had been waiting for her arrival longer than she would ever understand. Illyra demanded answers, asking why she had been brought there and why he was looking at her as though she already belonged in a world she had never entered. The Duke did not answer immediately. Instead, he extended his hand. The entire hall watched in silence as he asked her for the first dance, not as a request, but as a declaration that left no space for refusal. Gasps rippled through the crowd because no one had ever seen the Duke initiate such a gesture, especially not toward someone unknown. Illyra hesitated, every instinct telling her to step back, but something deeper, something tied to the unanswered invitation, the carriage, and the voice that had followed her, pulled her forward instead. As her fingers finally touched his, the chandeliers above flickered once, and a strange hush fell over the entire hall, as if time itself had paused to witness what was about to begin. The Duke guided her toward the center of the ballroom, where the floor opened like a stage prepared for something far beyond a simple dance. And as the first note of music rose again, he leaned slightly closer and whispered something that made Illyra's entire reality tilt. He said her name was not Illyra Vance in the records that mattered here, and that the royal ball was never meant to introduce her to society, but to reveal what she had been hidden from since birth. Before she could react, the music changed. The crowd tightened its circle, and the Duke placed his hand at her waist, leading her into the first step of a dance that felt less like celebration and more like unlocking a sealed truth. And as they moved together beneath the golden light, Illyra realized with growing shock that every turn of the dance was guiding her towards something that had been carefully buried beneath the kingdom itself. If this story moved you, subscribe to Sandy Love Tales, share your thoughts in the comments, and stay close, because the final truth behind who Illyra really is will change everything you think you understood about the royal ball.
Illyra Vance didn't just attend the royal ball. She was drawn into something far deeper than nobility, status, or ceremony. The moment she accepted the Duke's hand, she unknowingly stepped into a hidden story written long before her arrival. But the most dangerous part is not the dance itself, it is what the Duke whispered to her while everyone else believed they were simply watching a royal moment. Because in that whisper was a truth tied to her identity, her past, and a secret the royal court has buried for years. And now, nothing about Illyra's life will ever remain the same again.